title of my story today comes from the International Journal of Molecular Sciences. It's a review by 6 scientists all over in Poland, where they do a pretty good job at doing research in this area, but it's entitled Cannabis-Based Phytocannabinoids, Overview and Mechanism of Action, Therapeutic Application, Production, and Affecting Environmental Factors. So those last two things, so you often see these kinds of reviews about the therapeutic uses of cannabinoids and their mechanism, and I'll go through that in a second. But the cool thing about this paper that I thought was quite unique is they talk about production, so they talk about growing, and they talk about extracting, and they talk about environmental effects that affect basically what's found in the trichome of the plant. So this is kind of cool because, again, in Poland, certainly it's like many other Eastern European countries, they didn't really suffer from the cannabis prohibition that we've had here in the States, and they hadn't totally given up on the notion that hemp and cannabis have a number of different uses, not only as medicines but as materials. So I'll go through the abstract real quick, but then what I want to highlight is some of the things down in the paper. And so this paper is a review. It's a review that provides an overview of cannabis-based phytocannabinoids, focusing on their mechanism of action, therapeutic applications, production processes, along with environmental factors that affect their quality and efficacy. Phytocannabinoids such as delta-9 THC, CBD, CBG, CBN, and CBC exhibit significant therapeutic potential in treating various physical and mental health conditions, including chronic pain, epilepsy, neurodegenerative diseases, skin disorders, and anxiety. Cultivation of cannabis plants is a crucial role in determining cannabinoid profiles, with indoor cultivation offering more control, Jason, more control indoors. Isn't that good to you?
Mm-hmm. I love some indoors.
And consistency than outdoor methods. I think that's, maybe debatable, but okay, we can talk about it. Environmental factors such as light, water, temperature, humidity, and nutrient management, CO2, and drying methods are used as a key way to optimize cannabinoid content in the inflorescences. Inflorescences are basically just the cannabis flowers. This review outlines the need for broader data transfer between the health industry and technological production, especially in terms of what concentration and cannabinoid ratios are effective in treatment. Such data transfer would provide cultivators with information on what environmental parameters should be manipulated in order to obtain the required final product. So I'm going to scroll through the paper and just get down to the meat of the action, which is that THC has a number of biological targets in the human body. It's an agonist, which means it turns on the function of a very well-known receptor, the CB1 receptor, and that's the reason why there's a psychoactive and analgesic effect. It's also action at the CB1 receptor that is due to reduction in pain, so relieving muscle pain and spasticity. Increasing appetite is also a function of a CB1 agonism. Antiemetic effects, that's a reduction of nausea. Protecting neurons from glutamate-induced damage. This is all a function of delta-9 THC acting on CB1. When it acts on CB2, where it's a partial agonist, meaning that it's not as a full agonist as it is at CB1, it's responsible for reduction of inflammation because it basically turns off the a mechanism by which pro-inflammatory cytokines are released in the body, and so that reduces inflammation. It also improves neurological function, again, by its action on CB2. One of the other targets that's recently been investigated is something called GPR55, where it's an agonist, and that's also responsible for reduction of inflammation and reducing neuropathic pain. When it binds to GPR18, it's an agonist, and that's responsible for analgesic effects, reduction of inflammation, and reduction of interocular pressure. That's what would be related to glaucoma an antihypertensive effect, so it has a effect to basically lower blood pressure. So here's one that's near and dear to Matthew's heart, which is it acts on 5-HT3A. It acts as an antagonist here, and that's part of its interaction as an antiemetic. So that's the thing that controls nausea. It also acts on something called PPAR gamma, where it's an agonist, and that reduces or decreases blood glucose levels. So this is how it could basically help somebody who is diabetic. It acts as a vasorelaxant, so it opens up blood vessels, so it would affect blood pressure. It has anti-tumor effects, and it modulates intestinal permeability. So these are all happening because of THC binding to PPAR. There's also something called trip channels. There's TRPV2 and TRPA1. Their delta-9 THC is an agonist, meaning it turns it on. And again, that's responsible for anti-inflammatory and analgesic activity, as well as action on TRP8 channel, where it's an antagonist and also responsible for analgesic activity. It lists a bunch of targets for CB1. I'm sorry, for CBD. CBD is very, very different in how it acts on the body than THC. And so there's a negative allosteric effect that CBD has at CB1. It's an agonist or an inverse agonist at CB2. And there, this is how CBD helps reduction of inflammation as well as pain and perception. It's inhibitor at GPR55, which is responsible for its limiting tissue industry and inflammatory response. So that might help with, again, wound healing properties. So I'm not going to go through the rest of them, but I just wanted to get down to the bottom here and just kind of go through some of the areas that basically these compounds act on. So we've already talked about pain management and reduction of inflammation. As we all know, cannabinoids are active in controlling seizures, especially difficult to treat seizures with most anti-seizure medications. What we find, again, is that CBD is very, very effective. And I'm sure Dr. T would agree with me that this has been long known before the approval of Epidiolex. Epidiolex is an FDA-approved drug where CBD is the active ingredient, but you don't need to get your doctor to prescribe that. You could just basically use a CBD tincture. So these compounds are active, again, in controlling neurodegenerative disease, in particular Alzheimer's, progression of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And also it's active, as we know, in multiple sclerosis. So there's a few different models that show that actually cannabis treatment can actually lower the amount of MS drugs that are currently being used and make them actually more effective. So there's a thing for us to think about, Dr. T, that you could use cannabis along with drugs and now use a lower dose of those drugs and maybe not have all the side effects. So I've already mentioned that it helps with reducing nausea. The other thing it does is it can actually stimulate appetite. It also improves sleep quality. It can be used to control anxiety, musculoskeletal regeneration. So when you're talking about maybe healing after, say, like a hip replacement, Dr. T, I'm just pulling this out of thin air, but I would assume that any musculoskeletal operation or medical procedure that cannabinoids can actually help with because cannabinoids are known to recruit the cells that are in the body that both break down and build up bone. Those are called osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So those are all underpinned, again, by cannabinoid, endocannabinoid, and certainly phytocannabinoid stimulation. So I talked about neurodegenerative diseases. There's skin diseases, things like it's escaping me right now, but typical psoriasis, inflammatory skin conditions. There's a lot of autoimmune disorders where again the body's immune system is kind of on haywire, and cannabinoids basically reduce that back down to homeostasis. So yeah, I mean, to go back to Dr. T's story for a second, there is no plant like this on planet Earth that has active ingredients that can be used to treat so many different medical conditions. And I think what that teaches us about the endocannabinoid system is the endocannabinoid system is the body's own pharmaceutical company, right? And the way that the endocannabinoid system regulates the other systems, like the musculoskeletal system, like your nervous system, like your digestive system, like your central nervous system. This is the chemical communication system in the body. And it just so happens that that's what THC acts on. And through, Meshulam's pioneering work, we actually discovered the endocannabinoid system by trying to figure out how THC works in the human brain. So I think this research is, just fantastic. It's great to read these reviews, and you're sitting there in disbelief thinking that why doesn't the medical community understand that this medication has been around forever? Humans have been using this for a variety of different indications, and we need to figure out how to incorporate this into people's wellness. And, that's what I have to say about this. I'd be interested in what my colleague, Dr. T, has to say, and interested in the rest of what the panel members have to say from Cure Science Hall here at St. Michael's College in beautiful Colchester, Vermont. That's my story today, folks. Have a great weekend, and I'd be interested in what everybody else has to say.
Dr. T?
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. I think it just brings up the scientific community needs a paradigm shift when it comes to cannabis. Cannabis is asking the scientific community for a paradigm shift, and we've known about these single agents causing or creating benefit for quite a while. What they are struggling with is that they're all in one plant and being administered at once and given to a person that may have multiple indications for using it, and improving the multiple indications. So in our research group, we call it the many-to-many problem. And problem is a good thing, not a bad thing, because it teaches us when we solve the problem. But how do we understand this many-to-many interaction, many active ingredients for many potential outcomes? And how do we predict the outcome when we're dealing with so many different targets? The traditional farm development world has trouble with this. They really prefer single agent, single outcome to understand it. And so we've got to bring them along as we learn from the plant.
Man, this is super
deep.
Yeah, very, 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 very deep. I mean, but it just proves what a lot of the anecdotal evidence that us as cannabis consumers have witnessed over the years, right? This is like the in-depth scientific proof of what we have always alleged as far as anecdotal evidence. Am I right about that, doctors?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Mark.
Absolutely. Yeah, but the part I didn't cover in this article, Jason, which is kind of cool, is so they talk about all these potential therapeutic applications. Mm-hmm. And in the back end, they talk about cannabinoids and indoor versus outdoor. They talk about potencies, but they also talk about environmental effects that can basically provide different ratios. And so it's kind of cool. I've never seen the medical connected with the cultivation like this. So if you just take this one standalone document, they're not doing original research here, folks. This is a review. But it's a review to basically bring these two areas of science together. You got the medical therapeutic side, and now you got the cultivation side. And maybe that's where we have to meet, right, Dr. T? It's kind of like if you wanted to grow some medicine that was good for, I don't know, Alzheimer's or good for controlling nausea, mm-hmm. This might be a good article to look at and to say, okay, what is a good ratio? What are the scientific references? And, can you go back and, use this kind of methodology, again, to convince doctors who are skeptical on, why would I prescribe cannabinoids when, like Dr. T says, I have this long history with FDA approved drugs and it's a single drug. And, if I'm going to say lower my blood pressure, for example, so what's your garden variety drug for that, Dr. T?
Lisinopril, 10 milligrams.
Yeah, so 10 milligrams lisinopril. Or
amlodipine.
What about one of these cannabis ratios at the right ratio? Could you, justify basically saying, hey, maybe try a little bit of this tincture, or try, smoking some of this? The smoking thing has always got doctors all up in a tizzy because it's just not a healthy way to administer, but it's how humans have used cannabis for a while. But like when you have a patient in your office, Dr. T, and they're asking about using cannabis as a therapy, does the question of smoking come up, and how do you address that as a medical professional?
Well, I mean, with cannabis, it's not, I don't prescribe. I don't tell people what to do. I ask them what they're doing, and then we talk about where they want to go. And that's really more guidance than a prescription. Mm-hmm. So if they're smoking and they don't want to smoke, I can help them with that in terms of how to back off and how to substitute it for ingesting or topical products that will reduce the smoking. If they're smoking and it's benefiting them, and I have no evidence that the long-term use will be detrimental, then I, keep doing what you're doing. More power to you, and I'm glad that it's helping you out. And so there's still a lot of evidence. If they're using it for blood pressure, the question is, how's your blood pressure, mm-hmm. right? Often you got to be careful because just smoking for blood pressure doesn't last long enough because your pressure might be high. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if your pressure is due to a lot of stress and cannabis is reducing your stress and that's reducing your blood pressure, then great. It's not a direct effect, it's an indirect effect, but let's go with that too. Mm-hmm. So, it's a lot of observation. It's a lot of, what are you using exactly and what's the outcome, measuring it, biomarkers.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, the Cole Memo sent in a super chat, you guys. He says, Meshulam identified and isolated THC first, but it was Adams from Illinois who first synthesized THC by modifying the structure of other cannabinoids.
That's not entirely true. Okay. All right. And I appreciate the whole memo saying that. But the first people to isolate THC was Wood, Spivey, and Easterfield in 1896 when they did a vacuum distillation of cannabis charas that they brought back from India. Mm-hmm. Those people, it was difficult. I mean, okay, this is contemporary with the discovery of the light bulb. This is 20 years before the discovery of the electron. So in 1896, these Brits were the first people to ever make cannabis distillate. If you look at the boiling point of their distillate, it is spot on with Meshulam's boiling point, spot on with my own data. They were the first to isolate THC. Wow. And actually, Adams isolated THC. What Meshulam did, just to set the record straight, so everybody knows, what Meshulam did is he was the first to correctly elucidate the structure of delta-9 THC. What confounded researchers before that was they didn't have an analytical technique to fully understand the structure. In the early 60s, there was a new technique developed called NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. And Meshulam understood that there was a little bit of, uncertainty about what. See, the problem, Jason, is when they were isolating THC back in Adams's lab, it kept on isomerizing delta 9 over to delta 8. So they thought that delta 8 was the original configuration. If you look at Adams's papers, and I've read every one of them, every word of every paper. I've also read every Meshulam paper, in case anyone cares. But
we know.
I wouldn't expect any less.
Sure, what I can tell you for sure is that the first people to isolate THC on planet Earth was Wood, Spivey, and Easterfield in England, based on cannabis charas that they brought back from India. And wow. What confounded researchers early on in the late 1800s and early 1900s was the fact that the compounds from the plant are what a chemist would call metastable, meaning that it's very easy to isomerize delta 9 into delta 8, and they just didn't have the sophisticated analytical instruments around the turn of the century to correctly elucidate that. Shulam understood this, and with the advent of NMR in the early 60s, his isolation method and his NMR interpretation in his landmark paper in 1964 was the first time that the correct structure was elucidated as delta 9 THC. Before that, it was the other isomers, and again, other way that they identified products back in the Adams era of chemistry is they isolated natural products, and then they did chemical reactions to those natural products to make known derivatives, and then figured out the pieces of the puzzle by piecing it back together on understanding what chemistry they did. They used to make something called derivatives. And when you make a derivative that's a known crystalline derivative and you could purify it and get the melting point, you could understand what precursor molecule made that derivative. So in that process, they were isomerizing and really scrambling the natural configuration of delta 9. But Meshulam's most important contribution to cannabinoid science, not necessarily the correct structural elucidation, although that was a very important leap forward. He then asked, how do these things work in the body? And it was through his interactions with Roger Pertwee, my collaborator Alan Hallett at Wake Forest, and William Devane, that they isolated or determined what the CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors were, and also the natural ligands that our body makes, the endocannabinoids, anandamide and 3-HE. So for that, they should have certainly gotten the Nobel Prize in medicine, and who knows, maybe they will get a Nobel Prize someday for that.
Well, maybe
it's a tremendous contribution.
Maybe they will now when Kennedy takes over as the director of HHS. But also the Cole memo threw in another super chat and says, "We definitely care, Dr. Mark. Fascinating, and thank you."
Yeah, so I wrote an article for the American Journal of the Endocannabinoid Society or some shit like that. Go to my website. You'll see betterchemconsulting.com or .whatever, and there's a link to that article that talks about the early isolation of THC. And I do believe, just based on the boiling points being spot on, that they did not isolate cannabinol like they thought. They isolated tetrahydrocannabinol, and they were the first to do it.